Thank you all for turning into this video about punishment and prison, and really about sentencing and corrections is the area we'll focus in on the most. Now, we finished up courts and trials right before this, and now it's important to talk about the next stage of events. And essentially, what happens is the person that has been found guilty of a crime is sentenced. They have a separate sentencing hearing where they receive what would be their punishment, essentially. And it could be any range of different things, which we'll talk about on a future slide. But really, what's the purpose of having a sentence at all? What role does sentencing play in this entire process? And it fills four purposes. First, we could look at retribution. Retribution, as in kind of revenge or a feeling of justice for those that have been harmed. If you've been harmed by some sort of criminal, you may want that justice, them to receive some sort of damages for what they did. And this provides that. So they're not just getting a slap on the wrist, they're receiving some sort of punishment for their actions. Secondly, sentencing and punishment provides a deterrent for future criminals. So if you are thinking about committing a crime, you may remember, oh yeah, that guy, he got sentenced to 20 years in jail. I don't want to have to deal with that. And it may stop you from committing that crime. And remember, in some communities like Singapore, they have extremely harsh sentencing. Harsh to the point that it actually deters a lot of criminal activity, especially with drugs. So it becomes, the big question here, should all sentencing be extremely severe? But then again, there has been severe punishments as far as um, three strike rules in some states, which we can talk about in another day, or you look at the drug violations at the federal level. We're talking people in possession of marijuana plants can receive up to 10 years in prison. That could add up, and that could be a lot of time in prison for something that is seen as nonviolent. So it's questionable about whether or not this is actually that good of a deterrent. Now, aside from retribution and deterrence, certainly sentencing also provides incapacitation. And if you think about it from the law enforcement side of things, and if you think about it from the DA's side of things, you're actually taking criminals and you're potentially keeping them off the streets, and that could result in less crime out there. You're actually incapacitating someone that has criminal behaviors. And when we were talking earlier this year about why people commit crimes, you know that it can be difficult to get out of this mindset that you might need criminal behavior. And people that have crimes on the record also have a difficulty getting jobs, and that could create a cycle of almost getting involved with criminal activities because it could be difficult to find a job, and they could kind of fall back on their old criminal activities. So incapacitating some criminals does kind of keep them off the streets and keeps back some of the criminal activity we have in America. And lastly, of course, we have rehabilitation. Because yes, you can incapacitate criminals, but you really can't keep them all off the streets, and not forever. So when you're punishing someone, it can't be a harsh punishment for everything. You're going to have to let them go eventually. So sentencing should also provide some rehabilitation. It should have a system where it helps people to become productive members of their society. So people that are going to get released might have more options for education. People that are going to be released might have more options for working in group activities and working on jobs and trying to get some experience somewhere. Someone that has very minimal skills might get trained at something. Someone that has maybe anger issues might get counseling. Someone that needs medication might receive that medication. So you have potential of taking someone with a criminal past and trying to make them not a criminal when they get out from behind those bars. Now, where does the sentencing actually come from? What ends up happening is that the judges will determine your sentence. And typically what they would do is they would have some sort of sentencing chart. And the sentencing chart might look something like this. So here we have different types of degrees, Class A through Class J. We have the time period that they would receive in jail as far as a minimum and a maximum. So you can see someone with a G offense could receive anywhere from 4.5 years to 15 years in prison. plus a fine or just a fine potentially. And the judge gets to look at the case and decide how harsh of a punishment this person deserves. Is it their first offense? Are they very apologetic? Do they seem remorseful? Does it seem like they're easy to rehabilitate? Maybe give them a lesser sentence in that case. Did they do something heinous? Was it unbelievable, inattention? Was it seen as something horrifying? That's going to receive, a harsher sentence, making more of an example out of them, and a harsher punishment against that person as well. So really, the judges have a lot of flexibility with how they're going to sentence people. Now, some sentencing charts are even more complex. Look at this; it has different degrees. It also has different ranges of criminal history. So if you have more criminal activity on your record, you'll receive a harsher punishment. And it fluctuates over all these different months that are possible to sentence someone. But really, the judges get a lot of flexibility, and we're going to watch a video about a judge that has used that flexibility during class time. Now, what types of sentences can a judge dole out? Well, of course, the harshest punishment is capital punishment. And capital punishment is essentially life or death, essentially. What capital punishment could mean in most states is the death penalty. It's going to mean execution. And we'll talk about capital punishment in class because you'll be doing a little bit of debate on that. Not every state legalizes capital punishment, so it could be life in prison. And a state could have life in prison without parole, which essentially would mean that the person would die in prison at the end of their life. Life in prison with parole typically ranges around 45 years in prison. And those are kind of the harshest punishments you could have: capital punishment and imprisonment. You either are receiving the death penalty or you're receiving life behind bars. And both of those are potential options that states have. In Wisconsin, we do not have the death penalty, but we do have life in prison without parole. So people sentenced to life in prison without parole basically serve out the rest of their time in prison. Now, aside from imprisonment, and you could sentence someone to jail as well, but jail is only for a short amount of time. It's not going to be for a lengthy stay. Aside from that, you also have probation. You could sentence someone to go home and be monitored by the state for a certain amount of time. This happens a lot with people that maybe are getting released tend to get on probation. Newer offenses tend to be on probation. Probation and parole also monitors people like sex offenders, basically monitoring where they are, possibly monitoring things that they could get in trouble with, which we can get into a little more detail with on the probation slides. The government can, of course, issue out fines, which are things you're paying the government. They could issue a restitution request, and restitution is making sure that you fix whatever you broke. So if you stole something and sold it, you're paying back that person that you stole from. If you broke a wall or something like that as part of your criminal activity, maybe you have to fix that wall. Let's say you spray painted a wall. You could have community service to remove the paint from that wall or to fix something. And community service gets tied in very well too, because community service tends to be helping out the community, picking out trash, painting things. That kind of stuff can fall into the community service realm. And lastly, you can get things like restorative justice, which is essentially a program to help you to apologize to the people that you harmed. And of course, there's other simple things too that can be tied in with any of these punishments, which we can look at later on. Punishments can be very flexible in their creation. Now, who determines these sentences? It's not just the judges, even though the judges we just focused in on. First, it has to start with the legislators. Legislators determine what the rules and options are. They're the ones basically creating that board that the judge is picking from, the option board. And the judges then are selecting from those options. And what can happen, though, is that your sentence can be changed. If you're in prison to the end of your term, or at least closing in on the end of your term, you could be released early. And that's where a parole board comes in. A parole board can review your case, can review your actions while in prison, and can determine whether or not to let you go early. And that's a chance to basically, free up some space in jails and let someone go that maybe is rehabilitated or has tried to fix things in their life. Does it always work out perfectly? No. Sometimes those people that are released by the parole board are back before that judge in no time. But it is certainly giving them that kind of second chance, and it is adjusting their sentence in jail. Now, some factors that tend to play a role in sentencing is certainly the seriousness of the crime. Certainly, there's some such things as mitigating and aggravating circumstances. Mitigating are ones that tend to shorten the punishment, and aggravating ones tend to be ones that lengthen the punishment. Ones that are mitigating might be stuff like being younger or having one of those potential defenses we talked about earlier this year. Those might mitigate a punishment. They may shorten it or make it lesser. Aggravating ones make it seem worse. So it could be, I always think of violence against a child or violence against an elderly. Those types of things tend to get a harsher punishment. They're considered aggravating circumstances. So when you're hurting the elderly and you're hurting children, that's aggravating. Mitigating might be stuff like you are a child, or you suffer from some sort of serious mental illness, or maybe there was that mistake issue or entrapment going on. It could lessen some sort of sentence potentially. Oh, and one more aggravating circumstance is the fact that you might be a habitual criminal. If you're always in front of that judge, they're going to see that as a reason to give you a harsher sentence. You're not learning from your past sentences. Now let's look briefly at the death penalty. We certainly will look at it a little closer in class. Capital punishment, you can see, is not as used in the Midwest and in the Northeast. It is certainly possible in the South and in the West, but what's happening is becoming rarer and rarer to see any capital punishment, and a lot of that having to do with not a lot of clearness about whether or not it's legal for that matter. When you think of capital punishment, try and think of the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment says that basically there can be no cruel and unusual punishments. But guess what? Nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about what is cruel or unusual. And the Supreme Court has never ruled anything, cruel or unusual according to the death penalty. But there have been issues with certain execution techniques. Some of the execution techniques in the United States that have been used have been botched, as in they've failed to execute the person. And this creates potential issues of, are these cruel if they're not fully executing someone? And is the punishment unusual if the United States is the only country in basically the Western world with the death penalty? And is it becoming even more unusual as countries keep eliminating the death penalty? So it becomes difficult to determine what is that cruel and unusualness according to the Supreme Court. Now with the death penalty, it's important to realize some specifics. Since the 80s, the Supreme Court ruled that for the death penalty to be issued, the jury has to approve it. So it's not just the judge passing down a sentence, it's the jury determining if that person can receive death. And there are certain things that can be completely mitigating. For example, if you are a juvenile when you commit the crime, you cannot get the death penalty. And secondly, in most states, they've outlawed giving the death penalty to people that maybe have insanity pleas or have some sort of mental handicap.